that didn't quite make the cut that we'll be taking a look at today was known as Seth. Seth was a champion originally developed with the concept of being a sand mage, involving lore from the Shurima Desert and using sand magic as an overall theme for his abilities. Seth as a character had a couple of leaks early on from his original conception that showcased his concept art and hinted at a few abilities by showing some of the icons. Although we never received any actual details for the original design of his kit, this single picture shows quite a bit of some of his design concepts, and you can maybe take some guesses at what his original intentions might have been. Based on the power level distributions as you can see for his attack, defense, ability power, and difficulty, we can speculate that he had some kind of a tanky hybrid playstyle, and was a little bit less mage-like than the sand mage concept makes him appear, as you can see that his defense power is pretty high, while his magic power is actually kind of low. Although Seth was deemed to have an awesome concept and be a great starting point for the design of a champion, Riot wasn't able to work out a kit for him, and so they decided that Seth was just taking too long, so he was shelved. Later, the concepts for his character of being a sand mage with this bird-like form would be revisited about a year and a half later, and eventually be developed into, as I'm sure you've probably guessed it by now, Azir, who would go on through a few development cycles and redesigns and eventually be brought to life as a champion.
And let's move along the list to the number 2. One of the cancelled champions named Taboo dates way back near the start of League of Legends, when the files for this champion were discovered in the beta files. This guy seems to have been made into some form of voodoo shaman or witch doctor, especially since he seems to have been inspired by the witch doctor hero from Dota. At first, there was no real confirmation that this champion had been cancelled up until the year of 2010 when Riot released the harrowing map for League of Legends. In the corner of this map, you would see Taboo in a coffin, which ended up confirming that we will most likely not be seeing this guy and he has been cancelled. Now, the playstyle of this champion was going to be that of a mage type champion that messes around with his opponents by having several debuffs while also containing small buffs or heals for himself and or his allies. But speaking of his abilities, the names of them are still available and they are as follows. His passive was called Enfeeble, which had Taboo sap his enemy's strength, and it seemed to be an AoE type effect that just hovers around him. His Q ability was called Tattoo, which seems like it could have been some form of buff to allies that would increase their magic damage, or vice versa and be used on enemy champions to increase the damage that they take. His W was Rendering Cry, which seemed like it would be another AoE debuff ability with maybe some damage as well, reducing the enemy attack damage, their move speed, maybe even both, some form of debuff that could be annoying to play against. His E ability was Pacifying. The icon for this ability shows fear, which means that this would be some form of single target spell that would, well, essentially fear the target. It would most likely deal damage to the target as well, and chances are it's very similar to how Fiddlestick's current ability Terrify works. And his ultimate was Soul Drain, which would be yet another AoE type of ability that maybe deals magic damage and steals the HP from all of the targets hit, maybe even applying a debuff and a buff to enemies and allies respectively. Finally, there have also been some sightings of Taboo recently made by Riot, mainly from the splash art for the prehistoric skins released recently. Now, Taboo isn't completely forgotten, as his designs, his look, and his playstyle seem to have been carried over to Swain and maybe even a little bit to Fiddlesticks.
Next up, it's someone called Everdrian. He's one of the cancelled champions that has a little bit more of a story about their design. Back when Everdrian was still in development around 2010, lead designer Nocturne had Everdrian as his avatar picture on the official forums for quite some time, as a way to show his commitment to finding a way to make Everdrian work. He was still developing him, but he promised the community that if his development ended, he would change his avatar. In late 2010 though, Everdrian would appear as one of the 3 characters inside coffins in the Harrowing map skin for Summoner's Rift as a signature to say that they were cancelled. And eventually in July 2011, Nocturne would change his avatar picture to Ravager Nocturne, which implied that Everdrian had been cancelled. Of the data extracted from the beta game files, Everdrian potentially had abilities that fell under the names of Lockdown, Detonate, Consume Spirit, Astral Beam, and Astral Barrier. So maybe he was some kind of arcane mage almost? It's hard to say. Everdrian was rumored to have been reworked into Heimerdinger though. However, Riot Cornac confirmed that was just a rumor. His artwork was also used for Malzahar when he was on the PBE before his release, but it was quickly changed, so it's hard to say if that was of any significance, and it might have just been a mistake. And for the next champion, we're looking at one of my personal favorites, someone who is going to be called Soterius. His full name was Soterius the Hydrasoul, and he actually had quite a bit of background developed behind him. Soterius would kill his enemies by drowning them in thrashing waves and then revive them in holy water to serve as his acolytes. For years he went unchallenged, and he believed that if he performed a similar ritual on himself, that he would be reborn with a divine transformation of his body. His acolytes assisted him in performing that same ritual upon himself, but it didn't go as planned, and as he was about to die, he made one last plea to the higher powers. They would revive him, but at the cost that he would forever live to do their bidding, and he now goes on to serve them as the Hydrasoul. Most of Soterius' details for his gameplay were extracted from the League of Legends beta files, and for Soterius specifically, both his visuals and abilities were found. However, with that kind of process, we only really know mostly his ability names and can only really guess at what they actually did. His passive was called Vortex, which probably had some kind of interaction with the rest of his kit. His Q was called Torrent, which I imagine might be something similar to Miss Fortune's E, but instead of a hail of bullets, it was kind of like a rainstorm. His W was called Typhoon. This might have been maybe like a skill shot knockback kind of thing, like a faster but smaller Nami wave almost. It's hard to say. His E was called Soothing Aura, and this time we actually know what it did. It was a passive to emanate soothing waves of energy that refresh nearby friendly units. The passive aura it granted would restore mana per second to all nearby allied units, but it was at a pretty slow rate, so it's possible that this ability had an active component to it maybe, because if that's all there was to it, this ability is not that good. But lastly, his ultimate was called Water Elemental, which I can assume kind of goes off of his lore from reviving his acolytes to serve him, so he would summon an elemental to fight for him for the duration of the ability. Unfortunately, champion designer Ezreal would eventually say in 2010 that, well, Soterius would go on to be cancelled, and his kit didn't really come to life in any form so far, although it's not impossible that we maybe see someone similar to him in the future.
Next up, we'll be talking about Gavid, yet another champion that has been cancelled. Way back when, Riot seemed to be very keen on making all of their champions look human, and this was partly as to why Gavid, the Plant King who looks nothing like a human, did not make the cut and was cancelled. He simply did not fit with the game's artistic theme and design. Much like Taboo and Avergrian, his cancellation was confirmed by the 2010 harrowing map with the coffin in the bottom right as well. So this guy's playstyle is quite obviously revolved around plants, and having said that, I'm sure there's one current champion that he reminds you of, Zyra. And the reason for that is because his concept was most likely transferred into the creation of Zyra instead, and definitely inspired what she is today. But even with that being said, let's take a look at how his abilities might have been if Gavid was a champion in League of Legends today. His passive was called Thorns, and most likely was a very simple passive that just reflected the damage whenever he was attacked. His Q ability might have been two abilities, Sprout and Entrench, with the first part, Sprout, being similar to how current Zyra's W works, and then Entrench, the second part of his Q, working off of the initial part of his Q. Next up we have the W ability, Animate Vitals, making it sound like some reanimation type ability where he uses the power of plants to heal his allies one way or another. His E ability, Animate Thornspitter, is probably very similar to how Zyra's abilities currently work, where he would create a plant to attack his enemies for him. And finally we have the ultimate, Animate Entangler. This is probably very similar to Zyra's ultimate, but instead of knocking them up, it holds everyone down in an AoE fashion, similar to how Amumu's ultimate holds down all of the enemy champions as well. Either way, we won't be seeing the Plant King in Summoner's Rift anytime soon, or probably ever, but luckily for him, his spirit will always live on within Zyra.
Next up, we're taking a look at a character known as Omen. Omen was set up to be this demon-like creature, but there were a lot of uncertainties during his development. The designers were unsure whether or not they wanted him to be a melee or maybe a ranged DPS character, and his design lacked a lot of the direction necessary to finish a champion. He went through a lot of different designs and redesigns, from being an AD carry monster that shot spikes, to being this stealthy, almost cat-like character that played like an assassin, to being this void beast, and sometimes even trying him out as a jungler. Omen experienced a lot of problems thematically, artistically, and with his gameplay. The design team was unable to settle on a personality or character, or even some basic gameplay functions that they wanted Omen to accomplish. Riot Iron's stylist noted that he personally went through over 20 different versions of Omen, and many others on the design team went through their own handfuls of redesigns too. Omen was just one of those odd cases where even after trying 50, 100 different things, he just wouldn't click, and the writers decided that Omen simply wasn't meant to be, after having exhausted such a ridiculous amount of possibilities. Omen's thematic spot of being this kind of a void monster in League of Legends would eventually be filled by Kha'Zix, and a lot of his gameplay elements, or theoretical gameplay elements, would be brought to life in the form of Rek'Sai. So Omen has been brought to life in some way through those characters,